Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another catalog in brief. Alright, I've been wanting to use this format a bit more often to catch up on names I wouldn't ordinarily get the chance to look into, so today I've decided to go back to the world of the 70s Berlin School synth pioneers in Krautrock. A genre that very frequently features artists who have ridiculously prolific back catalogs, what with them having been most active in the 70s and all, but there are a couple of big names from this scene whose catalogs don't require absolutely back-breaking amounts of work to go through. And this was one who I'd known about for ages and figured I would probably like, but never found the time to look into before. Also whose final album released in 2009, and there is zero chance of a comeback thanks to one of the members having passed away a decade ago. So it's not like I was going to get any other opportunity to talk about them. So here we go. Kluster is best known as the duo of Hans Joachim Roedelius and the late Dieter Moebius, primarily active from 1971 up through 1981, with a few comebacks here and there afterwards. Technically, Kluster was originally formed as a trio, also featuring Konrad Schnitzler. Back then they spelled their name with a K, though that incarnation of the band only existed for about 2 years, starting around 1969, before they would disband. Schnitzler would retain the rights to the name, and so they renamed themselves to spell it with a C and enter into their most well-known era. Also, after their final album in 2009, Roedelius put out a couple of projects with a third incarnation of the band that spelled Kluster with a Q, though I am not going to be talking about those. Nor will I be talking about the absolutely insane amount of solo work that all three artists have put out. I'm not against the idea of like a Konrad Schnitzler video someday, although if that happens I kinda doubt I'll be talking about every album he's released under his own name, because there is frankly way too many, even by the standards of German synth pioneers. Like, I think his catalog's even bigger than Tangerine Dreams, which that is really saying something. But I digress, we're not really talking about Schnitzler that much today. This video is primarily just going to center around the albums released under the name Kluster spelled with a C. I did listen to the 3 Kluster with a K albums as well, so I'll mention those in the beginning as a bonus. And I will also be mentioning a bunch of their other high-profile collaborations, including their work in the supergroup Harmonia, since I feel like that's a bit of an important part of their story. And that group also only released 3 albums, so that's easy enough to tack on. I definitely didn't just put those in last minute. Although there are also a handful of like live albums and compilations under Kluster with a C that I skipped over, so this is not completely comprehensive. It's just enough to get the picture of this band's story while still, you know, remaining as brief as reasonably possible. So here we go. Here's my thoughts on the Kluster discography. Okay. So, I'm just going to mash together my thoughts on all 3 of the albums from the first incarnation of Kluster, spelled with a K, and featuring Konrad Schnitzler, all together in this one segment, since I have almost the exact same things to say about all 3 of these records. This is all, like, pure early krautrock experimental freakout territory. The first Kluster with a K album was recorded right around the same time as Tangerine Dream's first album, Electronic Meditation, and there's some pretty clear parallels between the style of that album and all these other projects. The first 2 Kluster albums, Klopfzeichen and Zwei-Osterei, each have one side of experimental drone with lengthy spoken word passages in German plastered on top, and the other side of just regular experimental drone without spoken word. I guess if you're into the absolute most avant-garde side of these genres, it could be an interesting time, though I don't know how much fun I had listening to it. Schnitzler had gone on record saying that the actual content of the spoken word passages don't actually matter that much. He's directly quoted as saying, "They sound better when you don't understand German, and if you do understand, you'd think it was terrible." Although I did run the passages through Google Translate out of curiosity, and I actually don't know if I would go that far. I mean, they were apparently both a result of the band being sponsored by a church and are thereby, like, religious in origin. Although there did seem to be, like, some surprisingly prescient social commentary snuck in both of them. The Klopfzeichen passages have parts that rant against the pointlessness of war and bombings, and I think even call for, like, a leftist revolution at one point. That's kinda sick. While the Zwei-Osterei passage has some bits that, like, talk about the environment and pollution and stuff after this whole funeral sermon kind of thing. It's obviously entirely possible that I may have misunderstood the original intent of said passages. It is just Google Translate, but, you know, there did seem to be, like, something of substance there. In any case, the words were more interesting to me than any of the actual music here, which may be, you know, freaky and avant-garde and stuff, but fell in the background super easily for me and didn't really have that much of interesting instrumental substance beyond, like, weird metallic sound effects to pull me in. The third Kluster with a K record, Eruption, technically a live album, is all instrumental, but it's more the exact same kind of stuff you heard on the instrumental parts of the other two. Maybe there's some, like, weird processed flutes, which are kind of neat, but there's also, like, some really sharp, high-pitched, distorted ringing that hit those old Aphex Twin Ventolin buttons for me and had me like, alright, I'm good, no thanks. At the end of the day, much like how I feel on TD's Electronic Meditation, all the Kluster with a K records are the kind of thing I can easily respect, but I very much hold from a distance. Interesting curiosities that I'm glad I heard once, but don't foresee myself listening to again. I can see them hitting more for those with more experimental-leaning tastes than mine, but on a personal enjoyment level, I just thought all three of them were fine. Okay, now let's get into the main story. Kluster with a C. Moebius and Roedelius. This is the stuff I was actually most interested in checking out. Also, this album technically credits the legendary producer Connie Plank as a proper member of the band, and I believe is the only Kluster album to do so. Although Plank would also co-produce a whole bunch of their other albums. Anyway, this album may or may not be their most well-known work, certainly has their most iconic album cover, and it's one of the earliest originators of the Kosmische music scene, picking right up from where the Kluster with a K albums left off in entirely experimental drone territory with very little melody. But this time repurposing a similar sound palette into a much more obvious sci-fi and space-themed package. Guitar distortions, synths, and other barely decipherable instruments are all processed to sound like buzzing machinery and dense dark ambient pads, like the entire experience is a soundtrack to being trapped in a spacecraft that's burning apart during re-entry and crashing. This album and, I guess, Tangerine Dream Sight from the following year kind of feel like they can go hand in hand as the beginning of dark ambient music as a genre as we know it today. Although this album isn't quite as ambient or minimalistic as that one, this still has more of its experimental rock roots still intact. The experience of this feels more predictive of the kind of stuff like the early industrial bands from later in the 70s like Throbbing Gristle would explore more. Now, in terms of my own personal enjoyment, I have come to feel this album is very good. Just through that slight shift in subject matter over to this sci-fi theme, it was able to connect with me a lot more easily than any of the Kluster with a K albums. Sticking to the space concept gave these sounds more of a specific kind of structure and purpose that I didn't feel like they had as much before. Although I'm not sure yet if I properly love it. I'm open to the idea that this could really click with me later. Like, I've given it at least 6 listens, and it has marginally improved each time. Though, as you would expect, it is a real challenge of a listen and requires me to, like, really sit up and pay attention to get the most out of. Also, it's one of those records where I feel like the first side interested me a bit more than the second side, which mostly felt like reprises of the same kinds of ideas. Again, I could see this theoretically clicking with me as great if I come back to it, like, months from now, removed from me actively having to, like, put in the effort to write about it. But I do really like it all the same, and it is obviously a classic, so there you go. The second Kluster album is more stuff in the same vein as the first one. It doesn't feel as focused or have the same feeling of like taking you on an overarching journey that Kluster 71 does. Probably a slight step down as a result. But having more tracks here does mean that there's a bit more variety. Some tracks focus more on guitars like the distorted drones and synths on Opener Plus, or the heavier looping riffs on Im Süden. Tracks like Für die Katz and Live in der Fabrik focus more specifically on the synths to create its spacey dark ambient pads. Georgel focuses more on organ drones. And the closer Nabite brings in rhythmic low piano notes and wordless background vocals and is pretty striking. Reminds me a little of the ending of TD's Atem album, albeit not quite as annoyingly off-putting, so that's cool. So yeah, nice stuff. I do like the previous album a little more, but this isn't too far behind. Alright, so next we gotta talk about a little side project they worked on called Harmonia, which is Moebius and Roedelius working in collaboration with guitarist Michael Rother, best known for his work in the band Neu. Initially, I wasn't going to mention the Harmonia projects, but I feel like they actually make for an important enough part of Kluster's history to merit bringing up in this video. Like, this album in particular fits pretty naturally into Kluster's progression as a band, while also being a pretty significant evolution on the sound they had before. Since, while all the sonic ingredients that went into this album are more or less the same as what was on Kluster 2, still primarily like experimental guitar drones with trippy synth effects and the like, structured into fairly impressionistic pieces. The compositions here are a lot brighter, more melodic, and easily accessible on average than anything they were doing before. More like the most accessible parts of Kraftwerk's really early catalog, like their track Kling Klang, for instance. And that would really set the tone for the directions Kluster would go in on their main albums afterwards. I will admit my favorite track here is the 11-minute one that sounds the most like what Kluster were already doing on their first two albums, but I feel like it hits as well as it does in the presence of all these other warmer and more melodic cuts to contrast it. I also like some of the percussion textures that have a bit of a dubby flavor to them in some parts. Oh yeah, and apparently this album was a fairly direct inspiration for Brian Eno as well. Shortly after this album came out, that was when he really started pivoting away from his more Bowie-ish art rocky sound in his solo work towards the ambient sound we know from him today. Put a pin in that. But yeah, another really solid project here, and a pretty massively influential one. Anyway, with the success of Harmonia, Kluster even further doubled down on the more melodic and accessible direction. It's possibly they may have had a little bit of peek over at the work of their colleagues from Dusseldorf, perhaps through their mutual Connie Plank connection, and thought, that whole synthesizer pop thing that Ralph and Florian are cooking up seems pretty cool, let's try doing some of that ourselves. The result is often considered Kluster's best album overall, and it probably won't surprise anyone to hear that I more or less agree with its reputation. Now, it's no Autobahn, mind you. I'm not going to say I suddenly prefer this over all those Kraftwerk albums that I have loved for most of my life. But, you know, this isn't a similar tier of enjoyability for me to something like Ralph and Florian. Not as well varied as that album, but there is certainly, like, a comfortable, approachable looseness to this material that you weren't getting out of other albums from this era. A sweetness as well, which fits for the album title. Zuckerzeit means, sugar time. It's also interesting to note how each track here is credited to either Moebius or Roedelius working solo. The tracks from Roedelius tend to be warmer and focus on variations on the same melodic motifs, where the tracks from Moebius get a tiny bit more experimental and add in a little more variety and flavors. Tracks like Rote Riki and James, with their dark ambient synths and guitar riffs respectively, link the closest to the work they were putting out before. So, yeah, a classic project to be sure. The second Harmonia album in 1975 sounds a lot more like what one would probably expect when you hear that Kluster and one of the guys from Neu made music together. It definitely sounds like a combination of the styles they were exploring right around this time, with the tender and more melodic tones of Kluster's stuff on Zuckerzeit, and the marginally more straightforward songfulness and occasional more propulsive rock grooves that resemble those on the Neu album, which would release the same year. By the way, yeah, Neu is a whole other side story that is probably not going to get a video from me. While they do use synths sometimes, they feel like way more of a rock band at their core, not really an electronic one as much. Maybe even a little proto-punk. So, not the right fit for my formats, though I can endorse their stuff as much as everyone else does. They do feel predictive of styles that would be influential on, like, the post-punk and maybe even post-rock scenes years later, and have their cool, more experimental and ambient moments as well, but I digress. This album, Deluxe, it's very nice once again, though I did like the first Harmonia album more, and I also think both of the regular Kluster albums that came immediately before and after it are better. In the context of the Neu catalog, it's like a fun, more synth-heavy experiment, but in the context of the Kluster catalog, it feels like another transitional effort. The next solo Kluster album further builds off the, I guess, slightly more song-focused approach of both Zuckerzeit and Deluxe, and ends up in even lower key and more ambient-ish territory. And I think the result is probably my personal favorite record they've put out overall. There's something of like a loose forest and wilderness theme to this one, evoking just going off into nature and detaching from society, with lots of even warmer and more heartfelt compositions than the warmest parts of the last album. With lots of even warmer and more heartfelt compositions than even the warmest parts of Zuckerzeit, bringing in some very mild folksier elements with guitars and pianos and stuff, but still primarily driven by synths. If the second half of the Kraftwerk track Morgenspaziergang or certain parts of Brian Eno's Another Green World left you hungering for more of that kind of vibe, then you'll get that in absolute spades here. The ending track in particular is an absolute home run of a melancholy piano piece. Yeah, this album is great, don't have much else to say. But of course, while we're on the topic of Brian Eno, that takes us to the third and final Harmonia record, technically released under the name Harmonia 76, which showed Eno personally coming over to join the supergroup himself. The results of their work together wouldn't actually be released to the public until all the way in 1997 for some reason, but I put it in this spot in their chronology since it was obviously recorded in 1976. Anyway, this is like a loose collection of fairly lo-fi sounding synth sketches, some shorter melodic pieces, a few weirder, more experimental moments, and of course, a couple of lengthy, purely ambient synth soundscapes. I don't know if I'd put this among the best work of any of the artists involved. It does in fact kind of feel like the kind of thing that got shelved for years without having been completely finished and finessed into something more cohesive, and the version I heard on YouTube wasn't exactly the best produced either. But, you know, there's plenty of cool ideas here to be sure, and enough of substance for it to still work and not feel outright incomplete. So yeah, good stuff again, but it feels like a starting point for better ideas to come. Another transitional thing, if that. But obviously, Kluster and Eno's collaborations didn't just end at Harmonia 76. Eno really hit it off with the duo and wanted to get some music out with them that would actually get publicly released, so they put out 2 more records together without Michael Ruther. Now, seeing as Kluster were already moving in something of a Brian Eno-esque direction on Sowiesoso, their actual collaboration pretty much just carries directly off the style that Kluster were already exploring on that album. More pianos and synths and easily accessible melodic soundscapes in nice, easily digestible packages. I guess this album might be a slight hint darker and spacier than Sowiesoso, and it doesn't have any individual moments as large-scale and impactful as that album's opening and closing tracks. All the tracks here are on the relatively shorter side, but it hits in all the same ways, reaches some comparable emotional heights, and might even include a slight bit more sonic variety than Sowiesoso. For instance, the track 1 brings in some sitars, which is cool. So yeah, I think this is also great. Definitely worth hearing for fans of any of the artists involved. Although the second crossover between Kluster and Eno, this time credited under all 3 artists' real names, might be even better than the first. It's made out of all the same sonic ingredients as the first Kluster and Eno record, though this one brings in a few more like jazzy and funky influences for much more of a pensive and mysterious atmosphere. Not to mention Eno provides vocals himself for a couple of tracks. Though once again, they make sure to save time for some exceptionally pretty piano cuts. Great stuff once again. I'm kind of embarrassed how, despite being such a longtime Eno fan, I never got to hearing these crossovers until now. Anyway, going back to the mainline Kluster records, this shows them bringing in a new producer to help them out after having worked extensively with Connie Plank on nearly all their other previous work. For this one, they instead worked with Peter Baumann from Tangerine Dream. This stuff evolves pretty directly off of what they were doing on their collabs with Eno, with, a set of more compact, miniature melodic synth pieces that have more of a defined direction, although don't necessarily add up to something more than the sum of their parts. The biggest highlight on this album by far is the title track, which takes up the entire second side and is basically like 3 tracks mashed together. Like, one evolving piano-driven ambient piece, hard-cutting into like kind of a weird, jamming, experimental slow burn groove, and then circling back into experimental ambience and piano by the end. The rest of the album is neat, although nothing mind-blowing. Some cuts can feel like playful theme-tuned score cues, although a couple of moments get almost a little too lighthearted and take to the point of like taking me out of the experience a little bit. The track Prothese switches over into like this disco-inspired groove that sounds like a more unhinged take on something like Giorgio Moroder's Evolution, and has like one or both of the guys just like randomly talking over it, and also the track like just ends in an abrupt hard cut out of nowhere. Half feels like a shitpost or something. While Manchmal is a tender little melodic synth piece whose melody sounds more like a German children's nursery rhyme or something. So yeah, this is a nice album, but probably their weakest under the Kluster with a C name up to this point. And then we get to the duo's final album in 1981 before going on hiatus. Off the promise of the album cover and title, I had been expecting something, fun and quirky, similar to what they did on Zwei-Osterei. Although this release is curious in a very different way. It's a lot darker and more minimalistic than I would have thought. In a lot of ways, this album feels like an attempt to bring their whole run full circle, make something that leans away from the melodies and into, weird experimental ambient trippiness, not unlike the first two Kluster with a C records, but created using the more straight-ahead synth frameworks of their later 70s work. I saw an old Discogs comment comparing this to Plastic Man's Consumed of all things. While this isn't quite as dark or minimal as that record, or as low-key danceable and cleanly produced, I can kind of maybe see the appeal being somewhere in a similar ballpark. There's no individual moment here that hits for me on the level of the title track from their last record, but I think this one's more cohesive and comes together better as a complete whole than that one. I don't love it, but I like it. I can all around respect it. Next up, fast forward all the way to 1991, 10 years after the release of their last album, and here's an attempt at a Kluster comeback, credited under the duo's real names, but, the album's got Kluster in the title. Anyway, you like MIDI? Here's an album made almost entirely out of the default MIDI sound font. Seems Moebius and Roedelius discovered this newfangled computer thing, much like many of their contemporaries on the scene had done around that time. I guess there's some mild classical influences in their arrangements, but otherwise it's old school computerized versions of the kinds of sounds you heard them explore around the Zwei-Osterei era. It's decent, I guess. Probably not absolutely essential, though. Next, they came out with another regular Kluster album in 1994. It's more the same kind of stuff as last time, nearly all stock MIDI soundscapes with a mild experimental soundtracky flavor, except this time it's a single hour-long track as per the title. I do like this a little more than Apropos Kluster for having a bit more substance. It may be an hour-long track, but it feels like the kind of thing that could fairly easily be separated into a whole bunch of smaller tracks. The experience is never outright boring or samey, and it constantly feels like it's moving somewhere. A lot of cool bell sounds too, which I like, but, it's still not exactly a masterwork of production either. So yeah, decent stuff again, but doesn't strike me as absolutely essential listening or among their very best work. But after that brief comeback, they took another even longer hiatus, filled only by a couple of live albums, which I haven't bothered to listen to, and taking us all the way to the end of the 2000s when producer Tim Story approached them to make one more Kluster album, what would become their final record, released in 2009. Compositionally, this is more or less a repeat of their last album, actually separating its tracks apart from each other this time, although both albums just kind of feel like a semi-continuous flow of lots of different low-key abstract ideas. However, this album is definitely a significant improvement on 1 Hour, just for the fact that it's not relying on the default MIDI sound font. The synths actually sound like synths, and while many of the instruments do still sound like digital VSTs, they're much more organic sounding and less stock feeling ones. The production is just all around a solid step up from either their other two digital era albums. It does still have a mysterious and pensive computer game soundtracky feel and aesthetic, but it's one that's markedly easier to immerse myself in. I feel like I'm hearing some dub-inspired elements in some moments again, which is cool too. So yeah, overall, while this may not be a masterpiece, it is a respectable high note for the Kluster story to end on. So there we go, that's my thoughts on the Kluster discography. The duo did still keep active with solo work after that point, though with Dieter Moebius having passed away in 2015, I think it's fair to assume that the Kluster story has officially finished and run its course. R.I.P. to him. Honestly, I'm just happy that their catalog together is as easy to digest as it is with so few outright misses. Definitely not something you're guaranteed to get with bands and artists from this particular era. So yeah, anyway, hopefully you'll get more of these kinds of videos in the near future. I'll admit this particular video took a decent bit more work to put together than I was expecting, but I also didn't want to half-ass things either for how important and well-loved they are. Some of the other videos in this format I have planned are for artists with even bigger and more prolific catalogs. I'm half expecting, or at least hoping, they'll be less complex to talk about to compensate, but we will see how that goes. Happy to have finally caught up on these particular legends anyway. In the meantime, but of course this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.